Este directorul al Direcției pentru Educație și Competențe din cadrul OECD, Organizația pentru Cooperare și Dezvoltare Economică. E un membru cheie în echipa de conducere a OECD, consilierându direct pe secretarul general al organizației pe diferite subiecte de analize și politici pentru promovarea creșterii economice și a progresului social. Printre multele sale responsabilități intră și coordonarea programelor pentru evaluarea internațională a studenților, PISA, cum sunt cunoscute, studiul privind abilitățile adulților, PIAC și multe altele. Și ce aș mai menționa înainte să-i dau cuvântul este că OECD a furnizat expertiză în cadrul proiectului România Educat al administrației prezidențială, dând sfaturi și recomandări în 4 documente de politici publice privind profesionalizarea carierei didactice în România, privind îmbunătățirea managementului educațional în școli din România, privind creșterea accesului la o educație timpurie de calitate și privind creșterea echității educaționale în România. Așa că vă invit să-i adresați întrebări în chat și în intervenția pe care o aveam după prezentarea dânsului, o să încercăm să preluăm câteva dintre ele. Mr. Schleicher, thank you for being with us today. Welcome to SuperTeach. We're very excited to have you with us, and we are all ears for your words for us today. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to share some thoughts with you here. Obviously, currently the pandemic is occupying all our minds. We have 1.5 billion students around the world and the parents who have figured out that in the future, learning with technology needs to work a lot better. On the one hand, it has become the lifeline for educational success. At the same time, also, we realize that remote learning doesn't address the many social functions of schools. I think this is where a lot of inequalities are rising. It's very hard to give students credentials in these times. Many countries have postponed examinations, which stigmatizes whole generations. And teachers have a hard time keeping up with those developments. Those are the realities around us that we need to sort of address. And if I just shed some data on this, the first thing, if you talk about online learning, remote learning, is that students need to have a quiet place to study. Now, in Romania, you can say that's possible for most young people, according to what they say for themselves. But actually, in a whole range of other countries, even that basic prerequisite, it's already difficult. The next thing you need to think about is, do you have a computer to work? And there you can see actually many young people in Romania, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, have difficulties finding access to technology at home. So you may have wonderful online learning facilities, but often not the infrastructure for students to use those kinds of facilities. Then there comes the question, are teachers really well prepared? And I must say, according to the PISA data, according to the judgment of school principals, Romania is quite well positioned on this. School principals in Romania generally judge the majority of teachers to be competent in the use of digital technology, but again, it's not universal. You have about a quarter of young people in schools where teachers are not ready for this. And it goes, up to the majority of teachers in some countries. So again, this highlights the need to upgrade and invest in the pedagogical qualifications of people. And then when you think about, the kind of modern platforms that we need to really facilitate good online learning, this is the biggest challenge. And you can see even in Romania, you can see only about 1/3 of young people at age 15 are enrolled in schools which provide a reasonable online platform for them. You can see there are considerable bottlenecks to address the needs for online learning that our countries still need to solve. And facilities is just the starting point. I think we have 21st century technology, but often only, 20th century pedagogy, and sometimes in 19th century schooling infrastructure. So those things to put together, I think that's what the challenge of teaching is about in these days. We see, for example, that only about half of the teachers in OECD countries are actually using technology regularly for projects or classwork. And on the one hand, you can say, well, Romania is one of the countries where this has improved most. Now, basically, between 2013 and 2018, you can see the percentage of teachers who frequently or always let students use technology for projects has doubled, even more than doubled. So that's quite good, putting Romania now in a quite favorable position. But again, you're only talking about half of the teaching force. So this is a formidable challenge. But the real challenge lies here. For example, teachers are quite comfortable to provide clarity of instruction. I explain to students what I expect them to learn. I explain new and old topics, how they're related. I set goals at the beginning of instruction. So the kind of classical role of a teacher, this is what teachers are comfortable with. Classroom management, you can say as well. I tell students to follow classroom rules. That's the case in 70% of the cases. I tell students to listen to what I say. And those are things the teachers are very comfortable with. But when you look to the gray bars, cognitive activation, those are the elements of pedagogy that are really conducive to learning in the 21st century. I give tasks that require students to think critically, less than 60%. I have students work in small groups to come up with solutions, 50%. I let students to solve complex tasks. I present tasks for which there is no obvious solution. Now we're down to 1/3 of students. I give students projects that require at least 1 week to complete, less than 30%. And in the COVID times, that's the kind of problems that are almost inevitable. Students need to learn on their own. They need to manage their learning on themselves. So you can really see how there's a big gap between the aspirations of the 21st century in terms of modern pedagogy and the reality in terms of teachers being comfortable with using technology. So that's, I think, one of the challenges that we need to address. If we think about the future, how do we build, how do we scale, how do we spread innovative pedagogical practice? Often education systems spend a lot of time to push new ideas into classrooms, but we often do too little to find the good ideas in the classroom, to scale them, to spread them. These are things we need to become better. And that's also what you can see in the learning outcomes. As you know, you mentioned PISA already. We track learning outcomes in PISA quite systematically since the year 2000, testing students around the world. And we started this in the year 2000. And the world was very different in those times. When you think about reading, for example, reading in the year 2000 was mainly about reading books, reading printed, reading linear text. And when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia. You could trust the answer to be true. Today, when you look at an answer on a question on Google, you'll find 20,000 answers to your question, and nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true, what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. It's about navigating ambiguity. You can really see how the demands on skills have fundamentally changed, but our education systems are not responding. Now you can see that here between 2000 and 2003, same outcomes, virtually no improvement. 2003, you could see technology being sort of becoming part of the reality. But again, the OECD average score did not actually change very much. 2006 was the year before the iPhone was invented. Now, Twitter was still a sound. You can see again, very, very little change in the capacity of young people to access, to manage, to integrate, to evaluate written information. In 2009, remember, that was when social media came into play. We started to talk to our computers. And once again, learning outcomes remained very stable. 2012, think about robotics, cloud computing, big data, biogenetics, huge changes in science and technology. And yet, or 2015, you can see artificial intelligence coming into play. But overall, what you can see is actually that our education systems did not really respond to those kinds of changes, despite the fact that expenditure on education grew quite a bit. And the most worrying sign is this, when we ask ourselves, How many students can distinguish between fact and opinion? You know, on OECD average, it's less than 1 in 10 students. Think about this. The number one quality in reading today is your capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage complexity, to find out, what is true and what is not true, what is right and what is wrong. And only 1 in 10 students could solve those tasks when they were embedded in fairly complex settings. And in the case of Romania, is 1.4%. Now you can say those figures are a little bit higher than in the year 2000 when it was 7%, but we live in a totally different world by now. This just highlights the urgent need for change in education. Now, the good news is some countries have, managed to move much faster. 4 provinces in China, for which we have data, have risen to the top on the scale. No? You can see also Singapore moving from good to great. In Europe, a country like Estonia, remarkable progress over very limited time on the screen here. Or you look to Portugal, one of the poorer countries in Europe, steadily seeing progress. Now Poland, moving from below the average to above the average. So there are good examples for some countries who have really moved the needle. Or you look to Peru or Albania, again, countries that have seen quite good progress in raising the quality of learning outcomes. And then, countries like Brazil or Turkey, the progress may not be looking so impressive, but at least they have got a lot more young people enrolled in school, which is the access kind of gap that we need still to complete. Sweden is an interesting case. You can see basically they used to be sort of one of the top performers in education. They declined in performance. And then in 2012, they started to turn things around and you could see them growing again. The reason why I think Sweden is so interesting because it shows us when we actually recognize the challenge and turn things around, the reality, the outcomes can follow. And then, of course, Romania also very, very good progress in the early 2000s. But since then, since 2012, you can see the same tendency as in many other countries that learning outcomes did not follow the pace of change in our society. Education, school education was falling behind. And that brings us to where our education systems are today. And this is not just a question of, adding more time. What we can see very clearly is, that there is huge variation in the learning time, the time that students spend learning. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, students spend close to 60 hours learning in school in blue and out of school in yellow. You compare that with Finland, where students spend less time in school, a lot less time, and very little time on doing homework. But when you look at productivity, you can see in Finland, students learn a lot in very little time, whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn very little. So the point that I want to make here is not about volume of time. It's how we use that precious resource of student learning time. It's the quality of instruction. So basically what you can see is what we need to do is we need to move our education systems. We need to advance from teaching students, just to reproduce subject matter content. Romanian students are quite good at that, to giving them better tools to facilitate complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working. And this is not just about cognitive skills, it's also about social emotional skills. And that the second challenge is, to move everybody up to high levels of performance. Education systems are very good in sorting people. It's true in Romania as well. But we need to become better to have every person to succeed. And that, of course, hinges on the quality of teachers. In the past, we used to tell our teachers exactly what to teach and how to teach. Today, we need to raise the caliber of teachers to create a strong profession that owns its practice. And of course, it has to do with work organization. High-level professional knowledge workers don't like to work in factories. They like to work in flat, collegial environments. They like to, be embedded in a strong profession. They like to combine professional autonomy with a collaborative culture. So those are the kind of changes that we need to contemplate when we want to prepare for the future. How do we move from, just reproducing knowledge? Romania is good at that, to actually inspiring the creation of knowledge. Let's think about it. If you, I just showed you before that, learning time and even money are not very good predictors for learning outcomes. But here is a good predictor for the quality of performance of a system. And that is the growth mindset that young people have. If you look to Estonia, for example, #1 performer in the OECD, and it's also the country where students believe that they own their success. If they invest their effort, they trust their teachers to help them, and they're going to be successful. They have this belief that success is not about genes and inherited intelligence. It's mainly about hard work and consistent performance and being not afraid of failure. And you can look at Indonesia, where students are not doing very well on PISA and they're not having that growth mindset. They believe that they are born with a certain level of abilities and there's nothing they can do about it. And Romania is sort of in the middle between that. But the line is not very straight. I think there are a lot of exceptions to this, but the point is fostering a growth mindset. Learning outcomes is not just with what we teach, it's also with the belief systems that we build in our student populations. When you think about growth mindset more closely, you can see students that have developed a better growth mindset according to PISA are more likely to be motivated to master difficult tasks. They have a greater sense of self-efficacy. They have less fear of failure. They set more ambitious learning goals, and they also value schooling more. Really see how this growth mindset is a very important predictor for being ready for the 21st century. In the 21st century, if you want your students to be creative, imaginative, you have to give them opportunities to experiment, try things out. If they try things out, they will have to take risks. If they take risks, they're likely to make mistakes. And if your education systems does not tolerate mistakes, help students learn from and with mistakes, well, they're probably not to be so creative. And you can see the growth mindset that young people have is a very important predictor for that. Now, if you think about technology in the future, it's so incredibly democratized. Everybody can collaborate, everybody can contribute. But we also see that technology is concentrating power at a rate we've never seen before. Technology is incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere. But it's also incredibly homogenized, squashing individual differences, cultural uniqueness. Technology is incredibly empowering. The most successful companies these days are not created by a big industry, but by a big idea. They have the product before they have the money. But technology can be also incredibly disempowering. When we become the slaves of computer algorithms that tell us, whether to turn left and right and how we feel and things like this, and where you end up on this chart has a lot to do with the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that we develop. In a way, you can call this a race between education and technology. Before the first industrial revolution, neither technology or education had a big impact for the vast majority of people. But then came the industrial revolution, and moving technology ahead of people and causing a huge amount of social pain. But then, that was the time when we built, universal public schooling, making people compliant with the norms of the industrial revolution. And that generated, generations of prosperity. But now we face the digital revolution. And that, again, moves technology ahead of people. And we see exactly the same signs of social pain. Young people leaving, university with a degree and having difficulties finding a good job. And at the same time, employers say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. How do we close this gap? How do we get people, again, ahead of the technologies of our times? That's the big challenge that we face today. And we have this dramatically expanding pool of knowledge, and it's all filled with so many different facets and features. So many things we can learn. And all of them come with people. I think that's a very, very important part of the equation. We do not learn in the abstract. Where you invested, your most time and energy learning in primary school may have had less to do with the subjects and a lot more to do with the teacher. Whether this was a teacher, who discovered your passions, your ideas, who recognized who you are, who helped you to become who you want to become. So basically, knowledge always comes through people. Learning is not a transactional process. Learning is always a relational process. And basically, the box of the curriculum is very, very small. And we try to put everything into this little box. But what happens often, when we do that the rich and beautiful features of our societies become just very shallow shadows of themselves. I give you an example. When you survey primary grade students in Romania about science, they're all enthusiastic about science. They like science. It's about, playing in nature. It's about, understanding cause and effect. It's about doing an experiment and things like this. If you survey 15-year-olds in Romania about their attitudes to science, many hate science. It's become a boring school subject, with formulas and equations. It has lost the nature, the spirit of science. And that's the problem with many of the subjects that we try to squeeze into this little box. What we often forget is, what makes learning really important. The realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment. Think about it. In the time of artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence is an amazing accelerator, an amazing amplifier. But it accelerates good ideas and good practice in the same way that it accelerates bad ideas and bad practice. Our capacity to make that distinction, to make good judgment, that has become the key. The realm of political and civic life, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, and design, those things are becoming increasingly important, and they risk to get lost in our 20th century kind of schooling architecture. If you think about this and more carefully, knowledge, of course, will always remain important. When we talk about knowledge, we often talk about disciplinary knowledge, physics, history, philosophy, and so on. But actually, what matters more is not the content of that knowledge, but the ideas of a discipline. Not what you know in biology and chemistry alone, but can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Those things are increasingly important. If we understand the roots, the architecture of a discipline, we can construct the knowledge later in life. If we just, accumulate knowledge at the surface and that knowledge changes, we'll be lost. Can you think like an historian? History is not about, names and places. It's about, understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it has developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes. Thinking like a philosopher, thinking like a mathematician. We teach young people how to calculate an exponential function. Great. But do we understand the nature of an exponential function, the idea behind it? It's very difficult for humans. We are born into linear spaces. Time is linear, space is linear. The idea of an exponential function is very, uncommon to, not intuitive for us. If we had a better understanding, we would have dealt probably very different with this COVID crisis at the moment. Now, we would have sent 10,000 doctors, not 1,000, when the problem emerges somewhere. So again, helping people to think, to build that kind of epistemic understanding, understand the ideas of a discipline rather than its surface. Interdisciplinary, learning, helping students to think across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines. Very, very important these days. And then, knowledge is just a starting point. And in fact, the world no longer just rewards us for what we know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. And that's why skills are so important. And when we talk about skills, the first thought goes to cognitive skills. Creativity, critical thinking, and obviously these are very important. But in the times in which we live, social and emotional skills are becoming the key differentiator. It's about, your capacity to imagine, your capacity to empathize, your courage, your leadership. Those things are becoming increasingly important, and some of them, are very hard to change later in life. For example, emotional control. Crucially important for your success in life is, when you are 2 or 3 years old, it's a skill. You can learn it, like mathematics and science later on. But when you are 20 and 25, it's more like a personality trait. So again, we need to get a better understanding of what kind of skills do we develop best at what age. The cognitive, the social, the emotional skills. Now, if you think about what matters most in the times in which we live, here's our reading at the OECD. On the one hand, it's our capacity to create new value, to imagine, our capacity to navigate ambiguity, to reconcile tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. We need to deal with uncertainty. And we need to take responsibility to mobilize our cognitive, social, emotional resources. When you translate this into pedagogies, is our ability to be open for the novelty, to anticipate. This is something that is very, very hard for education. We are very, very good to teach young people the established wisdom of our times. We're not good enough to help young people question the established wisdom of our times. Reflection, being able to step back, to see the bigger picture, to see the forest among the trees, and then again, to take action. Those things are crucially important. It's about rigor. It's about focus, teaching fewer things at greater depth. It's about coherence. Is aiming at interdisciplinary learning, but also to remain true to the disciplines. To have focus on learning that is thematic, that is problem-based, project-based, that is co-created in conversation. Those things are critically important. Now that's about the transition to the new knowledge, but let's also think about the transition to a greater sense of equity. Now, one of the things that I think Romania still needs to work hardest on to enable more students to attain better skills. How can we do that? Let me bring you back to the PISA scale. And let me take not Romania, but I take actually here a country from the middle. Actually, there is Romania. And you can see basically the performance gap on PISA between the 10% most disadvantaged students in red and the students from the 10% most privileged backgrounds almost covers the world. If you come from a poor background in Romania, you do as poorly as students in the Philippines or the Dominican Republic. You come from a wealthy background, well, you do like students in Denmark, in Germany, in Japan. Huge social disparities in the country. Some people say they are inevitable. They are just a feature of, income and parental education and all those kinds of things. But if that was true, we would see the same disparities in most countries. Let's have a look, at Portugal. What you can see is the 10% most disadvantaged students in Portugal, same background, same culture, same social background, they do as well as the average student in Romania. And if you look at the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in China, the 4 provinces from China that we have, you can see they do as well as the 10% most privileged students in Romania. So this is a huge challenge. Equity is never easy, but poverty need not be destined. There's a lot that education systems could do to have more students better succeed. That has also to do with variability between performance. If you go to Finland, for example, the closest school is always the best school. Many countries on the left side have achieved a very consistent level of learning outcomes. On the right side, you can see Israel, where there's huge variability in the quality of schools. Where you go to school makes a huge, huge difference. How can we get closer to the left to ensure that, it doesn't matter where you go to school, your school will always deliver strong quality. And Romania, again, has a longer way to travel to build more consistent quality. And this is about attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. If you're in Romania, basically, you come, from a disadvantaged background, your chance to enroll in a high-performing school is very, very limited. And that's true for many countries in that region. If you're on the left side, education mobility across the system is much, much better. So this is something Romania needs to work with, but the strong cross-country differences show actually that is an achievable goal. It's not entirely impossible. And we see that disadvantage is often compounded. You can see, for example, students from a disadvantaged background have less of a growth mindset. They often have less positive feeling. They're not satisfied with their lives. They feel a lower sense of belonging to school. They are more exposed to school bullying. They have a lower disciplinary climate. They see less teacher enthusiasm. They face greater teacher support. That's a good thing. But again, they're also learning is less social. And so you can see really, if you come from a disadvantaged background, it's not your only problem. The bigger problem is that you're likely to go to a school which is going to reinforce the negative aspects of social disadvantage. This is something when the 21st century education systems really, really need to work on. And the last point I want to make is actually to advance from looking upwards in the bureaucracy to keeping looking outward, to better connecting the good ideas of teachers. You can think about, teaching as it needs to be financially attractive. But even more important, it is to keep teaching more intellectually attractive, to build public confidence in the teaching profession, to also focus on professional preparation and learning, not just before you get into school, but to give teachers strong opportunities to continue to learning, to create collective ownership for professional practice. We at the OECD look at teacher professionalism across 3 dimensions. The first has to do with knowledge. And that's clear, you want to have a strong knowledge of your subject. You want to have a strong knowledge of how different students learn that subject. But you also want to have teachers to be very knowledgeable of their individual students. You want to have a high sense of, teacher professional autonomy. Where teachers can make decisions over their work. And last but not least, a collaborative culture is important. Let me highlight one aspect here from Romania. Now, where you can see actually on the surface, teachers are quite collaborative. They spend a lot of time discussing individual students, to go to team conferences and things like this. But when you look at the deeper layers of collaboration, classroom observation and looking at how other teachers teach, joint activities, collaborative professional development, team teaching, they're actually very, very rare still. But when you look at what makes learning successful, you can see teachers' self-efficacy is much better when teachers teach jointly as a team, when they observe other teachers' classes, when they engage in joint activities, when they take part in professional collaborative learning. So building a stronger collaborative culture is probably, again, one of the biggest challenges that our data show for Romania. And that has to do with professional autonomy. You can see teachers typically, have a lot of control over what they do in their classroom. But when it comes to the design of innovative learning environments, there's a lot more that we can do to get, draw on the good ideas of many teachers. Even in the world in which we live today, even the best education minister cannot solve the problem of millions of students and hundreds of thousands of teachers and 10,000s of schools. But if we can draw on the best ideas of our hundreds of thousands of teachers, we can build the world's best education system. Lots of challenges, but as you can see, international comparisons also show that we can achieve significant progress. In the middle of the 2000s, Romania was among those countries rising most fastest. But progress is stalled, and it is important to bring the country back on track. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schleicher. Very impressive and very insightful presentation. Lots of good things that came out of it. I know we're short for time, but just a few quick questions for you, if we may. From the perspective of the data that you see, what's the power of a teacher in this whole ecosystem of government administration, regional administration, school administration, teachers, parents? What's the actual power of a teacher in what you see?
Well, the quality of education can never exceed the quality of teachers. Governments, specify intended education policies. What happens with policies is decided by the teacher in the classroom. It's about the implemented policy, the achieved policy. So in a way, I think teachers hold the key for innovative pedagogical practice. Now, this is where the power lies, but this is not just it. I think the power of teachers is not just to translate, good intended policies into better implemented policies. More importantly, I think the power of teachers today is also to become really knowledge creators. In the past, we looked at teachers as the one who just, are in the classroom, you implement a textbook and do, what has been specified in the education system. In the future, teachers will be the designers of innovative learning environments. They will be coaches, they will be facilitators, they will be mentors, they will actually work with their colleagues to actually create tomorrow's learning environments. And I think that's really where the real power lies. So not just in doing, a wonderful job in the classroom, but also to become the owners of professional practice. In other disciplines, we see that already happening. If you go to the medical profession, now you don't have a Ministry of Health that takes doctors how to do their operations. It's actually the medical profession itself that, defines its work practice and standards. And I think this is...
That is true for many other industries and professions as well.
Yeah.
Right? All right. What's the kind of support that you find most effective to empower teachers to move to this next level of teaching and learning in order to maximize their impact on the learning of their students?
Yeah, again, I would think that most of the support needs to come from within that profession. I think what we can do in an education system is to create more space and maybe some incentives for teachers to spend more time together to observe each other's classrooms, to engage in lesson study and professional learning communities. This is the big strengths that we can see, for example, in the East Asian education systems. You would teach a lot less than a Romanian teacher, but you actually work more and you spend more time with individual students out of the classroom, with other teachers, doing research projects. If you go to China, for example, if you have a good idea as a teacher, you think I could do something better, you'd write to the government, they're going to give you money to actually try it out. And at the end of the day, when you're successful, the government will not tell you this is right or wrong. They will ask you, okay, sounds really interesting. Show us that you can actually replicate this in 10 other schools. So you become the kind of engine of progress and change. And I think that's really what we can do to make teaching not just financially more attractive with better salaries, but to make teaching intellectually more attractive.
All right. Good, thank you. We had an earlier question earlier in the conference regarding the relevance of PISA test, and I would address you an invitation maybe to comment a little bit on the relevance of PISA, how is that evolving, and generally maybe you would like to address, the challenges that people have towards PISA.
Well, you can look at this in two ways. I mean, one perspective would be to say, given that in Romania, a lot of the teaching focuses on the transmission of knowledge, the PISA test is not fair to Romanian students because the PISA test actually asks students to creatively use and apply that knowledge, to actually solve problems where they have not been prepared for. That's the idea of the PISA test. So one perspective would be to say, well, PISA is not relevant for the Romanian context or not so relevant. That's one way. But I think another perspective is to think about, in a world in which we live, just being able to repeat what others have told you is not sufficient. The modern world will actually require students to think creatively, to think on their own feet, to be able to apply their knowledge in novel settings, to extrapolate from what they know. And that's exactly what the PISA test measures. So I do think the PISA test is very relevant for the future of work, for the future of our societies, even if the Romanian education system is not so well aligned with this. Anyway, we have become very good to educate second-class robots. We educate people who are very good to repeat what we tell them. But I think in this time of artificial intelligence, we need to think harder. What makes us first-class human in the time of artificial intelligence? And I think this is where PISA really sort of makes a big contribution. It really elevates our sense of outcomes to the more human attributes, cognitive, social, and emotional ones. But I highlighted, for example, the aspect of growth mindset. Some people might say, oh, that's just a nice to have. A growth mindset is not the core of education. But as you could see from some of the data, it's a very powerful predictor for your view of learning, for the view of yourself. And so you need to look at those aspects.
All right. I know that the OECD has supported the Romanian presidential administration with advice on 4 key policy documents. But since in our conversation today, you mentioned very well the power of the teacher, actually, that being the most important in this whole ecosystem. Maybe you'd like to share with us a few of the key takeaways, a few of the key recommendations that you've made to the Romanian administration presidential that the teachers in our conference today can take away with them and basically start working on those priorities.
Yeah, some of those recommendations go beyond what we're talking about today. Like we stress the importance of early learning and the child well-being to really start early on with the education systems where Romania is not very good yet. No, I think the education system starts when people get to school. So this is one, and they're a little bit out of school. But the second pillar talks about teacher professionalization. Now, what can Romania do to first, I think actually initial teacher education, according to our judgment, is actually quite good in Romania. But the system does very little to help teachers continue to grow in their careers. Basically, there is very little of a teacher career in Romania still. There is few incentives for teachers to keep learning, to keep growing, to be challenged in their ways of working. So we put a lot of emphasis on those kinds of aspects. And then, as I highlighted also today, the issue of social inequality is also real. I think this is one of the big challenges that remains to ensure that every student in Romania has access to excellent teaching and that the country becomes better to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms. So those are some examples, I think. But I think, again, this with regard to our conference today, I think it's really about creating an environment in which teachers not just disseminate lessons, but where they really become creative designers of tomorrow's learning environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schleicher. Very inspirational presentation and very inspirational answers to our questions. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today, and we look forward to having you back with us soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.